Hey folks, all right, we've got a great crew here today to talk about fantastical worlds. I hope that everyone who's listening will really enjoy this and get a lot out of it. To start off with, I figured it would be nice to have everyone introduce yourself and talk about what sort of fantastical worlds you have made. Shalina?
Who would you like to start?
I was going to have Shalina start, I think.
Sure.
I can start. My name is Shalina. I write under the pen name T.S. Valmond, and most of my fantasy is YA. I wrote the series The Bellagi Kingdoms and The Bellagi Empire that are out now on all platforms.
Okay, Martha?
I write mostly urban fantasy, some fantasy, and the two worlds, Orsarin and Terra Nobis, and then some standalone books, Gothdraw and War Mage. War Mage is more fantasy, but everything else is pretty much urban fantasy on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited.
Okay, Nazri.
Hi, I'm Nazri. I write exclusively urban fantasy, and essentially everything is a melting pot of world mythology and urban settings. It's been fun.
And my name's Kevin McLaughlin, and I've created a variety of fantasy worlds, probably more urban fantasy than anything else, but I've also written some epics, some historical fantasy, fantasy taking place in a video game afterlife, and some other stuff too. Great. I'd like to dive in first and have people talk about what sort of world building they do to create these worlds for themselves. I know some folks just sort of like do it on the fly, and some folks, create a huge world Bible. What sort of things do you do in order to make that work for you?
Do you mean in the terms of world building or in terms of characters?
In terms of world building. We're talking about the worlds here more than the characters right now.
First, to create a mythology so that there's a strong base that goes back a long ways. Also, since I collaborate, that makes it possible for others to come into the world. Michelangelo and I built Orsarin together, and it's important to have a wide-ranging, bigger, arcing story that can cover everything. And then we talk about the rules of the magic. You have to know what the rules are and what the base is. And like Terra Nobis uses bubbles. It's very, very different. And you have to just go through all the rules, make sure it works, that it can be interpreted in different ways. Who can use it? Who's magical? Who's not? Etc.
Mm-hmm. I think in my case, I made a very conscious effort to be able to incorporate the craziest things possible, because there's a bit of, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of world mythology in what I do, but there's also Lovecraftian elements. And in that sense, I guess I kind of adopt the Lovecraftian template of weaving in mystical elements into real world events and real world characters. So you've got gods posing as, let's say, politicians or major public figures as heads of corporations, and kind of trying to blend into modern society. It's essentially the old world trying to integrate themselves into the new, and then all the magic stems out of there with the heroes, and the main characters trying to figure out, what is reality versus the veiled reality that's hidden behind the city itself.
And for me, I tend to dream my worlds before they come into existence. So I don't have to share it with anyone, thankfully. What comes from my dreams is what I put into my worlds. And the YA fantasy series, literally the map of the world came to me in my sleep. And that's what I wrote. I based off that entire civilization based off a map I dreamt of and the people that came to me in that dream. Once the series kind of started going, I knew that, because I write in both science fiction and fantasy, that I wanted this to be a society of people that would eventually, that were spacefaring and would eventually encounter the species that I write in my science fiction as well. So I kind of wanted to have a strong community, a strong home world for these people. And that's kind of where the idea came from. And I just have that one series so far, but it's kind of multiplied upon itself, and it keeps growing just on its own.
The dream thing is really cool, I gotta say.
I'm super jealous. If I could receive things in my sleep, then I'd be a millionaire.
I lucid dream sometimes, so I'll wake up in my dreams and be able to make changes.
Yes,
which is really, really fun. But I don't do world building that way. That's really cool and special. For me, I tend to pants my worlds. I have a general plot idea or a general concept of a character or something like that, and then the world building happens as I write usually. A note to the audience, to folks who are listening, I am watching for comments on the StreamYard thing. So if you have any comments or questions, please do write them in, and I'll be watching for them to get people to answer them. All right. Fantasy is an incredibly broad set of genres. It's more than just a genre, I guess, in some ways. What sorts of things do you think that readers and fans are looking for in their fantasy worlds, in their fantastic worlds?
Well, I write urban fantasy, so it's that means it's in a realistic setting, much like Nazri, and often in urban fantasy, not always, but often the magic is hidden, and so there's this kind of cool idea that the reader, magic really does exist. We just haven't been clued in yet. It could be anywhere, and also Michael and I have individual tropes, and I tend to, in the books that I write alone, where the main character has a set of friends they would do anything for. They run towards trouble, not away from it. There's no whining. There's no angst. And that matches Michael's and my personality too. And we don't do giant cliffhangers, and we don't leave the main character in peril for chapters on end, which would create angst. And so that's within the genre. The reader comes to expect it. If we break those, there's going to be big trouble. And it gives, magic is supposed to be a place to escape. So this gives you a chance to escape without having to worry if your blood pressure is going to slowly rise, which is the worst. It's better to take that blood pressure up really quick and then back down quickly. So you get the ride, but you don't feel that dread. And the other thing that they expect to see are some creatures that they're used to, like elves or witches or wizards, but maybe a few that the author came up with that are kind of new and different, because that's fun. They want a mixture of both.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say it's similar. I like my readers like the characters and the creatures to be familiar but different. And my readers come to me because my stories tend to be very family friendly. I don't do a lot of mystic kind of magic. It's more like it's an alien world that just happens to have certain rules and a certain structure. But the readers really enjoy the adventure aspects. So my books are very quick. The world building is there, but it's not kind of in your face or over your head. It's just part of what the experience is. I think in the reading of the story, it kind of comes out more. But I do feel that some of my readers would appreciate even more. They love some of the fan art that's come out of it and some of the images that have been kind of propagated through the groups. But I love having kind of the reader do some of that in their own imagination and not feed them too much, not spoon feed them too much.
I agree with both Shalina and Martha. Like, after polling my readers, I've discovered that they do enjoy a mix of the familiar and the new, like things that they normally wouldn't see. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only author out there who tries to infuse a little bit of Malaysian, or I'm Malaysian and Filipino, and I try to infuse a little bit of Malaysian or Filipino mythology and folklore into my stories. But the thing is, my readers seem to appreciate being able to learn about these things that, we have vampires that dislocate themselves from the head up, and it's just a floating head with a bunch of entrails and a spine dangling from it, which is the grossest thing in the world. But they seem to enjoy that kind of stuff when it's introduced to them. So, I have like the standard, the big Hollywood pantheons, like the Greeks and the Nords, but I also try to slip in stuff that's from on the fringes, so it kind of keeps things fresh. And I guess readers do enjoy that to an extent, but like Shalina said, I am cautious not to introduce anything that's too out of this world, and I don't think I've done that so far. So.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of do a mix as well, I think. I'm thinking back, and like the Steel Dragon stuff that I've done with Michael Anderle is very familiar to people in some ways. It's got dragons and pixies and dwarves, but it's very unfamiliar in others, in that dragons are basically in charge of the world. They're the political leaders and superstars and stuff like that. So it's a different. There's take the familiar and then twist it a little bit, I guess. Which brings me into, that's a great segue into the next question here, which is going to be, there are archetypes there that people have sort of settled on for each type of fantasy. Tolkien is probably the best known for epic fantasy. The Dresden novels with the hidden world sort of urban fantasy. For horror, Lovecraft is still probably one of the archetypes there. But how do you work around either utilizing or not utilizing and blending your own ideas into the archetypical ones?
Do you mean archetypical characters?
Worlds, like for instance, we look at epic fantasy. That's the easiest one to look at. If it's got orcs, dwarves, elves, goblins, wizards, stuff like that, you're looking, if it looks like a Dungeons and Dragons game, it's basically based off of Tolkien. And there's some books out there which very, very closely follow that, and there's other epic fantasies which diverge from it wildly. The Game of Thrones series is an example of one that's branched out pretty significantly from that. So how do you balance that sort of original, the core tropes for a subgenre, with the desire to do something a little different, to break free from that? Or do
if you're going to dance with the traditional, you better know it really well, because readers will be happy to point out where you got it wrong. Yeah. If you're going to use the traditional and bend it, it's a clever thing to be able to do that, and so that the reader understands you do understand what the traditional is. You're kind of using it and going in a different direction. But I think it's fun to take the traditional, and playing D&D helps with that, by the way. But it's good. It helps to it's fun to take those and then add a twist. So you didn't really change up the entire thing, but maybe, like in a dream, you wake up or you're standing in the shower and suddenly this thing occurs to you that you could add that wouldn't violate the rules, but it's kind of fun. And I agree with, what Nazri was saying, that I think when a reader picks up a book, they're hoping that you've done some different things. Otherwise, why read it? I mean, the Lyra Chronicles, I'm on book 14. And so, to keep myself entertained as well, I have to keep layering in different things that still comply with all the rules that back up behind it. And it's still fun. I mean, I was writing, and I am, by the way, not a pantser. I'm a very much an outline girl. But while writing, suddenly this idea occurs to you, and I created an entire train system that you enter through Starbucks, because how there's a Starbucks on every corner. So why is there a Starbucks? Because it's actually a secret entrance back by the bathrooms where no one would go, of course. And underground is a railroad system all over the world for magicals. And suddenly that's over time become a key component of the entire series. And readers love it because it's kind of funny too, that the entrance is back by the bathrooms. And humor is a big thing with me, and some swearing. So if you read my books, just so you're not shocked. And So I think it's a lot of fun. And I read books, by the way, hoping that there is something clever involved there. Even if it takes me a few pages to kind of catch on to what you're doing, I'm willing to hang in there with good writing. And then I love it because I know I'm going to be on a different kind of a ride. And yeah, great characters, by the way, for me is everything. If you don't have great characters, you know, the way they talk to each other, the way they converse, the rest is going to be no go for me.
Yeah, agreed. I think for
Myself, my characters really, I mean, I know we're talking about the world in itself, but it's the characters for me. I mean, I only came to fantasy because I was just tired of not seeing myself in the stories, not seeing more people like me in fantasy.
I make up my own
languages, I create my own cultures, I, you know, create my own kinds of dichotomy, just because I wanted to get away from what was traditional. So I'm one of those people that doesn't really touch a lot of the more familiar tropes, and I'm sort of shifting my stories to be less like that and more like as if it was an alien world. But it's marketed as fantasy because that's how it reads. It's a fantastical world, and it wouldn't be understood to the reader any other way outside of that without more background being built. And I'm working on writing more of that, but that's where we are so far.
Welcome back, Nazri.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Internet's tripping. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
It's okay. Totally. We're still on the same question.
Sorry?
We're still on the same question.
Oh, okay, cool. Personally, I've been grappling with this issue throughout my entire career, which is a funny thing to say since we've, you know, it feels like a very young industry. But like Martha was saying earlier, as an indie, it is easier. I mean, you do have more opportunities to play and experiment with the stories that you're trying to tell. And it's always a challenge trying to balance things between reader expectations and the things that you do want to write or express. Like, say, recently I asked my readers how they felt about my stories, because similar to Martha, a lot of my urban fantasy is very humor driven. And the stuff that really does dominate the charts, especially in my niche, which is stories with male protagonists, is stuff that I tend to go, what do I call it again? A bullet teeth, but grimsdark. You know, like it's always a dude in a trench coat. He's gonna be firing guns right to your head, and that's how he saves the day. But my guys are kind of the opposite of that, so it's a little difficult figuring things out, and I think I'm still finding my footing in that respect. But the good thing on the opposite end of that scale is that if you do find the target readers that you would have, the type of people who would appreciate the stories that you tell, then that's a great segment to service, and it's as far as I can tell, I found a pretty good base of readers who do enjoy stories with, shall we say, softer boys, with more unusual mythologies. But I suppose as time goes on, I'll be able to gain a better understanding of how to weave the traditional with, you know, the more independent aspects of what we do.
For me, I tend to not like sticking to the primary tropes all that much. I tend to borrow from them a little bit sometimes, but mostly I try to do something that's pretty different. Like some of the story ideas that I want to work on next year, I want to do a urban fantasy werewolf series where the werewolf is sort of kind of like Batman or Green Arrow from the Arrow TV show. With that sort of background and that sort of setup, but he's a werewolf, you know, and see if I can, you know, like try and tweak that angle. Also, we don't have a lot of like werewolf adventure protagonists in urban fantasy. I thought that would be fun. I have another story idea that's revolving around an alien invasion, which sounds like science fiction, except that the reason why the Fermi paradox exists in this idea is that all the other species out there in the universe got rid of all that radio and stuff like that ages ago because magic is so much better. And so they're coming in with magic as technology. which I thought, again, it's a way of kind of like flipping it over a little bit and changing things up, taking an idea that feels familiar and then altering it. So Martha has mentioned a couple of times how important characters are to fantasy, and I completely agree. I think that's really, really powerful. I'm going to kind of give people an open mic on this one a little bit and say, what kind of characters do you think are most important in fantasy? How do you build the characters that your readers love? Stuff like that. Talk about characters for a minute.
Well, so again, I think every writer has tropes that their readers expect that are unique to them. But so I can tell you what mine are that do happen to be similar to Michael Anderle. When I'm building a character, it's what's the baseline where they're starting from. So how can they evolve? I mean, if they're already doing great, there's not a lot of room to grow. And also I surround them with regulars that I'm not going to introduce, but I know over time who's going to be the regulars and are they magical, are they not? There's probably a mixture of both. Do they have any family? And because I have found, especially if you're going to do a long series, that having relationships of people they can bounce off of and watch those relationships grow is the main reason why someone will go from book 1 to 2 to 3. They want to see their friends. They love the adventure and all of that, but they're really interested in sitting down with their friends again. And they need to be likable. I mean, no one wants to hang out with an asshole. And so they're going to need to be people that I like, and and then our tropes are, that if one of Lyra's friends are in trouble, she's going to show up. If James Brownstone, he's going to keep it simple, but he's going to kick their ass. And there's a lot of humor. I mean, we're doing Johnny Walker, Dwarf Bounty Hunter, and he has 2 hound dogs that are the comedy relief, and only he can understand what they're saying. And so you can even create a relationship with 2 dogs. But it's the how do they speak to each other. And also, by the way, they always speak to each other with respect. There's no contempt. The insults are light, and over time, there's a growing affection for each other that is real and genuine, and you can feel it.
Other folks?
I can go next.
I think my
Readers expect from me very similar themes, because most of my stories
have some
kind of theme revolving around family, found family, specifically the family that you're not necessarily born to, the family you make. And in my fantasy series, I have a specific character who is basically rebelling against her family. She's never been into their agenda. And so she sets out determined to be without family, determined to be independent, but winds up finding, the exact kind of family she needs, and actually her true family. And the readers like that I throw in the occasional mythical creature pet. I always try to have a new one per book. They stay around as long as their life cycle provides, and then they have children. So there's cubs, whatever I can get away with in the stories. I love to include pets. That's a huge thing for me as well. But most of the time, my characters they have a main mission, they have a main goal, but there's always that underlying agenda of that need to find their family, to find their home, to find where they fit. And I think that works with the kind of characters I create, because the characters that I choose are always, if they're on the fringes themselves, or they are ostracized for some reason, they tend to need that community. The Bellagi Empire kind of takes my original series into the future, and I wanted to have a mermaid mix because I had a mermaid type species on the planet and I wanted her to be deaf. I wanted a deaf mermaid who wanted to be basically a musketeer. She wants to be a royal guard. And everyone in her family's done it. You know, she wants to be like the rest of her family. She's kind of like the opposite of all my other characters. She's the one with two parents at home. She's not orphaned. She's got sibs, like the whole nine. But the being able to write a character with a disability, I think, is a huge thing right now because we just don't have enough. We just don't have enough. And so I try to, you know, I put out my one story in the hopes that there will be more deaf writers who will write from their own experience and come into the space and play in fantasy, play in science fiction, because I just want to see more of it. Selfish reasons only. I hope my readers still like it.
100% on the concept of found family as well, because not just in urban fantasy, but I think, in other areas of science, speculative fiction, the main characters, not just the main characters, supporting characters as well, have the experience of being othered because they are so different from everyone else. I mean, from something as you know, as basic as I have magic and you don't, and how do I deal with this? Which is why I do admit that I tend to play on a lot of common tropes as well. My readers have come to expect that in many cases, the main character will be a naive ingenue who needs their hand held as they're led through this magical new world they're being introduced to. There's going to be naturally a mentor, and you know, that's a skeleton. We just dress that skeleton up in different shapes and guises. I have one example is an ancient lich who is a good guy. It's an undying lich who happens to be one of the heroes. Another is an angel. I mean, typical things like Kevin was saying earlier, you know, you give them something familiar, but try to put a twist on it. Like, I think the idea of a werewolf superhero is super interesting because you pull them in with a werewolf for the urban fantasy aspect, and then you weave in an entirely different subgenre. It's fun and exciting, I think. But also, like Shalina said, I've been having a recent problem with introducing pets because nearly everyone. Every person in my book, I mean, you have the sidekick, of course, but now everyone is transforming into a Disney princess because I can't help myself. And I introduce like a small furry animal with magical powers or the ability to speak. And I think I need to wean myself away from that, but it seems like readers are enjoying it. So far, I'm not getting punched for that just yet. So
you could make it a swearing troll where there's some, you know, mild offense, and then you kind of get out of the whole.
That is very true. That is very true. Make it a little rougher around the edges. I like that.
Yeah, but don't make it look too cute. I don't know about cute trolls.
A good point as well.
Yeah.
No, I think your cute troll is awesome, actually. For me, boy, what Shalina said about differently abled people, I've gotten a lot of. Actually, the first character like that I wrote was a science fiction character, actually, who was in a wheelchair and went into space anyway. But more recently, I wrote a fantasy story about a deaf girl, and I got a lot of letters from people basically saying, "Wow, this is really something special. I don't read books like this. You know, like I don't see this kind of character introduced." And I found that really, really gratifying. I used to be a nurse. I was a nurse for 10 years before I, you know, went full time as a writer. And so I've seen a lot of people with assorted medical and mental health disabilities, problems, whatever. And I think that a lot of the time we don't really introduce those in our characters. And I think that that's a really valuable piece of the puzzle to include sometimes. I know I've talked about PTSD and some of my more warlike fighting type stuff, because this is a reality of, you know, when you have thrown your character through a whole bunch of really crazy traumatic stuff, guess what? There's trauma. You know, so making that happen is really worthwhile to me. We've got a question coming in from the audience. How does what you have learned from your first genre help you switch to the next genre, i.e. fantasy to science fiction or vice versa?
Well,
I'll say, go ahead,
yeah,
Martha.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna
say for me, it kind of helped hone down the fact that I really should be writing science fiction because most of my fantasy adventures are basically alien adventures. So I don't know if that really counts as the same thing, but it did help me to figure out why I was drawn to fantasy. Because that was the first series I put out, even though everything I'd written up until that point had a science fiction bent. But I don't regret it. I think that's a series that's going to continue on, regardless of how it found me in my sleep, basically. But I've been very, I would say it's been really great being welcomed into the indie community and allowed to interact with authors who are doing both. Some of them are doing fantasy, YA fantasy and epic fantasy or urban fantasy, and then others doing science fiction, YA science fiction. All of those communities, I think, because we talk to each other about what the predominant tropes are and what readers really want to see, it helps you to kind of develop one series or another, depending on how you're going. And some people decide after they've done one that they're done with it. They're never going back. They stick with the one. I'm just not one of those people. I know I'm going to be writing multiple genres for the rest of my life. That's just who I am.
Yeah, within Oracerin, we have really good urban fantasy and really good YA fantasy, and both sell very well and people adore them. And what I learned from it is, again, it's all about the characters, but YA urban fantasy, the relationship is different. Kids in high school, what matters, that you need a best friend. You may not need that necessarily in regular urban fantasy. And it's really to pay attention to the individual tropes of the genre. Not everything translates even within urban fantasy. And you've got to know it well to go play in some other sandbox. You can't just say, I really like it, so I think I'll try it. You need to, in order to break the rules too, you've got to know what the rules are in the first place. And the other thing is, it's always going to be about the characters, but there's going to be tropes that define. And we do bring in some sci-fi because Michael in particular really likes it. And really in Terra Novis, there's a lot of sci-fi because Earth turns out to really be a ship that got lost. And Charlie Case, The Adventures of Finnegan Dragonbender, starts in space, and he's been searching for John Wayne and this lost ship, and finds his way to Earth, and then it becomes urban fantasy. So, you can play with both. You got to pick a genre, though. I mean, Michael's a good example because he is a vampire in space, but it's in the Chronicles gamut, which is wildly successful, but it's marketed as sci-fi. And so you have to pick who you market to. You can never, to date, I haven't seen it work where someone decides to market across the board. It tends to muddle the playing field. So you do have to kind of choose.
Nazri?
Are you frozen, Nazri?
Frozen. Oh, all right. I'll answer while he's unfreezing.
Okay.
So I've kind of always written both, so this is not the easiest question for me. I wrote my first science fiction story when I was 7 years old and took second place in a contest with it, but I went right from that into writing fantasy afterwards. And I've gone back and forth pretty much forever. The one thing I will say as a caveat is related to what Martha was just saying, and that is study something before you go and sit down and do it. I've written several science fiction romance novels, and the reason why I did that was because I had an editor suggest that I add more emotional resonance into my stories, more emotional overtones. And the people who do that best in the world, I figure, are probably the romance writers. So I read romance for about a year straight. And by the time I was done reading all of that, in order to try and learn, how to add more good emotion into my stories, I was like, okay, well, now I want to try one. So I wrote a couple of them, and they did okay. I got into RWA and PAN and all that fun stuff. But the thing I would say is study the thing that you want to do before you do it. if you try and write military science fiction and you're not a military science fiction fan and you're not a prior military person, your readership is going to know really, really fast. You don't have to have been in the military to write good military science fiction, but you do need to study the genre and the tropes and the tone and the words and the language and all of that stuff. And the same is true for romance. If I had just tried writing a science fiction romance without ever reading a romance novel, I would have been in trouble. And nobody would have liked it very much, or it wouldn't have been a romance or something. So really take the time to do a deep dive, I think, when you're switching, even when you're switching subgenres, like if you're going from space opera to military science fiction or from epic fantasy to urban fantasy. Take the time to do a deep dive into the people who are the best and currently most popular. So the best over all time, look for the big highlight, the blockbusters of that subgenre. But also the people who are currently trending, because then you can get a little bit of information about what's happening right now, because it's not always static.
And that's helpful too, because when I was new, that within urban fantasy, like Shane Silvers and I could be said to be similar, and yet we're not. He's much darker than I am, and so that also teaches you that there is a space for you. You don't have to suddenly morph into something else. You're just going to need to find your lane and drive down it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes though, that lane, you just gotta give up on it, because before I started here, like I was looking at the question, I was wondering, I've never written in a different genre, and then I remembered that I actually do have an entirely dead pseudonym that was a gay romance post-apocalyptic zombie horror. Who's gonna buy this stuff? You know what I mean? I had a handful, and I'm talking an actual handful of very dedicated readers who were very happy with the stories. But like Kevin and Martha were saying, I didn't read any romance whatsoever. The closest thing to this is Warm Bodies, that which I didn't even read, or I didn't even watch the film, which just goes to show you, like, what are you doing? So I realized after a while, looking at the science fiction and horror elements of it, that a lot of this actually aligns with the stuff that I do enjoy, which is urban fantasy and paranormal suspense stories. And I did my research finally, exactly as Kevin said, did my homework, read some of the classics, read some of the people who are trending at the moment, and that's how I found my footing in the world. Within the genre itself. So agreed completely. Make an effort, do your homework. Don't just put something out there.
Yeah, I think every writer out there who's been doing this for a little while can sympathize about I had a great idea for a story, and no, it was not as good as I thought it was. All right, in fantasy, especially in longer series, we often have a problem with power creep. You beat the bad guy in book 1, and now you have to have a bigger bad guy in book 2 to beat, and then there's an even bigger one in book 3, and by the time you're at book 12, you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? Like, what am I going to do? How do you handle power creep? How do you prevent it or work with it or whatever in your series?
So the Lyric Chronicles, again, it's a long series, and nobody wants to see the same bad guy for that long either. It's like, come on already, kill the guy or something. And so what I did was, so around book 4, I started dropping hints and weaving in that something else was coming, so that by the time in book 8, when the first one's killed off, the second one is starting to build, and now I'm doing it again, where they aren't necessarily more powerful than each other, they're just different. And you know how things evolve out here in the real world too, as we're all noticing, and things aren't necessarily worse, just different. So that's what I find to be, that's a great question, because I find if you're going to do a long series, what really helps is to start laying the groundwork early that something else is happening that the main characters haven't truly noticed yet because they're focused over here, but the reader is starting to kind of pick up the breadcrumbs. And then as the first one dies, suddenly there's the second. And there's no power creep at all. It's just different.
Cool.
I would have been better served knowing about this earlier on in my career in terms of a lateral transition of power and threat, because my major issue is that I'm addicted to serial escalation, where you start with, oh, they're going to destroy the city. by book 9, oh no, they're destroying the universe. And I'm like, what happens in book 10? Wait, we saved it. Nothing's gonna happen at this point. So I'm relegated. I mean, I'm basically stuck to writing short stories in this universe from this point on, unless I find some, macrocosmic threat to their universe. So I've been working very hard on making my threats more not realistic necessarily, but more palatable, like easily chunked down in terms of if I do want to build a longer series. Like now I know if you want to end this series at 6 or 9 books, sure, have him go up and punch Satan in the face. But if you want this to go for a little longer, maybe stick to, jewel heists, that sort of thing for now.
This is where plotting something out is super useful so that you don't write into the wall, even if it's just highlights. I like how Shalene is laughing. I have a feeling she's got something to say about this, but it's really helpful if you say, hey, here's the overarching thing, here's the second one, here's the third one, and then at least I have a framework so I don't go driving off a cliff.
Good point, Martha. Good points. I got nothing to say against it. I'm a major plotter. I plot novellas and then I turn them into books. But mostly what happens, what I notice though is pantsers hate to hear that. That's why I'm laughing, because I have very high empathy. And a lot of people, I can feel all of my friends who pants going, no, I refuse to. Anyway, but I was thinking back to the question of escalation. I don't have a long series yet. I'm still relatively new to publishing. So I have no problems with like blowing up the world to start with and then working my way, finding the characters and figuring that out. But for the series that I have currently, it's still in the lateral phase. It hasn't escalated because the abilities that I want to incorporate into the world don't show up for much later. So it kind of gives me some time to play around with where they are before any of these abilities are introduced, and then where those abilities come from slowly builds. So I haven't gotten to the point yet where my series needs to end. So I guess I'm listening like everyone else out there in the chat, just kind of like, okay, I need to keep this in mind as my series continues. So,
the other kind of creep that I think I have to be more careful of is the main character's powers not creeping up, trying to keep them interesting and keep them vulnerable so that you don't do the Superman effect.
Right. Make sure that whatever their ability is, it can't solve every problem, or it doesn't solve the problem at hand. Yeah,
it can become problematic if you're not really. I'm in the middle of dealing with that with the thing I'm doing with Michael right now, the Dragon's Daughter stuff. This is the worst power creeping series I've ever had. Is usually I try to look at cinema a lot of the time for advice on how to do things, and so like some of the best examples of non-power creepy stuff. James Bond, he's always the same. Always has pretty much the same assets and abilities every single movie, no matter who the actor was, and he's always trying to stop somebody who's basically going to blow up the world if Bond doesn't succeed. So it's always save the world or not, and it's always the same abilities. It's a different venue, a different villain, a different bad thing. Mission Impossible movies are much the same. So these sort of franchises could literally go on forever. Because there's no creep on either end. You're going to be faced. You're going to have the protagonist with X, Y, and Z powers. You know that there's going to be an antagonist who's out to destroy the world or do something really bad to lots and lots of people. And then all the details are what actually makes the story fun to watch.
I like that, but I don't like it because they don't have a lot of character arc. That's the only thing that kills me. I don't care what happens to Bond as much as I care about what happens to this, naive, vulnerable character and their change. So it's kind of like you got to sacrifice one to get the other if you're gonna.
It's the difference between the hero's journey and the Lester Dent plot formula. Really, the Bond movies are a great example of the Dent formula versus the hero's journey, which tends to have a character arc. But that's a different topic.
But if you have
all right, we're a little short on time. Sorry, go ahead, Martha.
I was going to say, if you took James Bond and made him a little more vulnerable, which would be against the trope, and had relatives and characters, then that would make it a very different. And so you can do that in your own books where it's got the James Bond element. You just make them more vulnerable, and you get to see into their lives with the people that are closest to them. And he goes to see Moneypenny, but it's a very minimal relationship. You don't ever get to see what he's truly like. So that's easy to fix if if that appeals to you.
All right, we are just about out of time here. I wanted to give everybody a chance. We got one more question, actually. So quickly, do you have a famous author who greatly inspired you?
Real quickly, Alice Hoffman, Practical Magic, and I'm probably going to murder this guy's name because I've only ever seen it in writing. So if somebody knows it correctly and I just murder it, let me know. Michael Chabon, Chabon. He wrote Summerland. Is one of the best urban. It kind of like rides the line of urban fantasy, and it's the book on that I just love. So Alice Hoffman and Michael Chabon. I'm sure people will write to me saying, "This is how you say it."
Frank Herbert and Stephen R. Donaldson.
Neil Gaiman. Iconic.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. For me, it was Tolkien. Even though I don't actually really like his books all that much right now, when I was in kindergarten, my parents were talking to friends about him, and I wanted to read the book. So that he was the author that inspired me to learn how to read and read well. And I read The Hobbit in kindergarten, The Lord of the Rings in first and second grade, and Silmarillion sort of read after that, but I didn't really get it. But that was what gave me my jumping off point to everything else. So yeah, sort of him. All right, in the last minute, where can people find you on the internet?
tsvalmond.com. You can find everything, how to reach me, all the books. My YA fantasy, I don't know if this will show up on that's the cover of the first book in the series, The Bellagi Kingdoms. Come check it out.
Cool.
MarthaCarr.com. And also, if you're interested in jumping into the universe, we give you a timeline that you can, and we kind of walk you through, here's where you start so that, you're not confused. Here's where it's one era. It's actually two. So that's the easiest way. And we update it constantly.
Cool.
NazriNoor.com, as it says below. I think I made an effort to murder every other Nazri Noor on the internet, so I think we're safe. Like if you Google, you should be able to find my stuff. So
yeah, I'm at KevinOMcLaughlin.com, and there is a free short story. It's one of my favorites. I wrote it as an ode to the little lost opportunity drone, so you can grab that right from my website. All right, we have seconds left on the clock. Anybody have any other closing comments they want to make? Any last questions from the audience?
Thank Amy Dubois for doing this in the first place. This is
thank you, Amy. Correct.
I miss seeing everybody.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much organization and design it takes to do something like this. She did it in a short amount of time, pulled in some nice big names, had an entire set of topics. I mean, big shout out to her for wanting to do it, and then it's a classy job she did too. It doesn't look like she sat down. She did a top-notch job. So last few seconds, big shout out to Amy.
Yeah, this has been awesome. All right, thanks everybody for your time, and thanks for coming to listen. And we'll see you around.
Yeah.